My name is Ivy Schweitzer, and I have the privilege of being the co-director of the Gender Research Institute at Dartmouth's Institute for this spring with Patty Hernandez, who's sitting in the front there. And this is the third in our series of public events. And I usually have a prop, but I kind of forgot it, the grid poster with all the events. We had two wonderful events. The next event is actually next Thursday with Rhodessa Jones, who will be talking about stories from the edge of the world. And the third event will be a screening of It's Criminal, the film that was made about the class that Patty and I co-teach, where we take students into local jails and drug rehabs to work with inmates and residents on a performance project, which we then perform for the community. The goal is to facilitate the voices of the inmates and the residents. And this film is 10 years in the making. This was the 2010 film. And we're going to, it had its premiere in LA at the LA International Women's Film Festival in March. And we will be bringing it with a panel of the director, several student alums, and several women who were in the facility at the time and are in the film who will be here talking with us as well. And so mark your calendars for that. And I talk about that just to give you a little background for our third speaker, Dr. Gabor Mate. So just a little bit of background. Patty and I started to work with incarcerated people in 2004. We had students working with us on a volunteer basis, and in 2007, we started offering courses at Dartmouth for credit. We continue to this day to offer those courses. In fact, we're doing one this spring. It's called Telling Stories for Social Change. And we're working with the Sullivan County House of Corrections and a group of incarcerated men. What we realized in the course of a long time working with these populations is that many of these people are substance abusers with a complex array of issues involving dysfunctional families, sexual and domestic abuse, mental illness, self-harming. Although we looked around, we could not find written accounts or explanations of addiction that approach these complex issues in a humanizing and humanistic way that take a broad view of addiction, because, as Patty always says, we are all in need of rehabilitation. All of us. Oh, and I almost forgot, let me just interrupt myself for a second. Before we proceed, GRID is directed by a wonderful person who we need to really recognize because she makes this all possible, and that's Annabelle Martin. No? Not recognized? So thank you, Annabelle. I almost forgot. And Nancy, where's Nancy O'Brien? Nancy O'Brien is the administrator for GRID, and she just does yeoman service. Nothing would happen without her. So please just give Nancy a round of applause. I didn't want to forget that. And I should also thank the Rockefeller Center for co-sponsoring this event. Sorry, I forgot to do my duty here. Okay. So get back to, as Patty says, we are all in need of rehabilitation. So Patty heard about Dr. Mate's work when somebody she knew, who knew that she was working with incarcerated people, said, I heard this great talk on Democracy Now!, and you should go and listen to this man because I think he's talking your language. I think he's speaking in ways that will really kind of appeal to you and answer the questions that we had. And Patty did go, and the next year we started teaching Dr. Gabor Mate's book in our class, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction. Now, Dr. Mate's innovative and holistic work on addiction and recovery comes directly out of his experiences as a family practitioner and palliative caregiver for 20 years, and for 12 years working with hardcore addicts in Vancouver, Canada's downtown East Side. He's authored several best-selling books besides in the realm of hungry ghosts, including When the Body Says No, The Cost of Hidden Stress, Scattered Minds, A New Look at the Origins and Healing of Attention Deficit Disorder. And he's also co-edited a book called Hold On to Your Kids, which is about the importance of parents in children's lives over their peer groups, which usually in this day and age of social media, it kind of takes over. He puts his theorizing into practice as the co-founder of Compassion for Addictions, a new nonprofit organization, and this fall will be launching a new website offering online courses in his areas of expertise, the first of which will train health professionals working with people with addiction in harm reduction approach. Now, he's recognized as a groundbreaker in several fields. Dr. Mate has been the recipient of several awards, the Hubert Evans Prize for Literary Nonfiction, as well as the 2012 Martin Luther King Humanitarian Award for Mothers Against Teen Violence. He is also an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Criminology at Simon Fraser University. He is rightly celebrated for his broad perspective on addiction that weaves together the latest scientific research with compelling human stories and his own insights, struggles, and spirituality. What drew us to his approach was his brutal honesty about the people he treats as well as his own imperfections, the utter failure and racial injustice of the so-called war on drugs, and his unrelenting insistence that, quote, the addict is not born but made, and that, quote, we avert our eyes from the hardcore addict not only to avoid seeing ourselves, but to avoid facing our share of responsibility. I can describe the effect of his work on us by citing two other works that have been important to Patty and I. The first and foremost, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by the Brazilian educational philosopher Paulo Freire, which teaches us that words and theory must always be united with action and activism. And Black feminist Bell Hooks's appreciation of Freire in her inspiring collection, Teaching to Transgress. In that essay, Hooks describes herself as a, quote, subject in resistance to the white, Western, patriarchal paradigm and, quote, dying of thirst until Freire's ideas quenched that thirst. This is how Patty and I felt on reading Dr. Mate's book. In passages like the following about Serena, a young Native woman driven to addiction and depression, Dr. Mate captures what we feel every time we are privileged to work with folks in local jails or drug rehabs, and what we want our students and the people who come to see the performances take away. Because seeing the human is the only possible way to change attitudes and thus to create just and effective treatments and policies. So let me read this very short passage. For those of you who have the book, page 58. And here is where I'm humbled. I'm humbled by my feebleness in helping this person. Humbled that I had the arrogance to believe I'd seen and heard it all. You can never see and hear it all because for all their sordid similarities, each story in the downtown East Side unfolded in the particular existence of a unique human being. And each one needs to be heard, witnessed, and acknowledged anew every time it's told. And I'm especially humbled because I dared to imagine that Serena was less than the complex and luminous person she is. Who am I to judge her for being driven to the belief that only through drugs will she find respite from her torments? Spiritual teachings of all traditions enjoin us to see the divine in each other. Namaste, the Sanskrit holy greeting, means the divine in me salutes the divine in you. The divine? It's so hard for us even to see the human. So thank you, Dr. Mate, for helping us to see the human. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gabor Mate.
Well, thank you, Ivy, for that very kind introduction. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, you can hear me at the back? Yeah? All right. The young woman in that chapter that was just quoted, I call her Serena, I think her name was Patricia, and she died a month after the publication of the book. Just as I was on book tour, she died of a brain abscess caused by her HIV. You can read about her and her story in a chapter I dedicated to her, or devoted to her story. So the question then is how to understand addictions. I mean, why would somebody persist in a behavior that ends up killing her, having seen the devastation that the addiction has wreaked on her friends and family, knowing of her own illness, resisting even getting tested to get her CD4 counts, the blood count that tells us about the activity of the HIV virus. And you can read her struggle and my struggle with her over that in that chapter. But why would somebody do that? Now there are basically in North America two dominant theories, and one of them dominates social thinking and policy and the legal approach, and the other one dominates the medical approach, although they do get mixed together. The one theory is articulated most recently by your current Attorney General, Mr. Jeff Sessions, who recently said, "We need to say, as Nancy Reagan said, just say no. Don't do it. And our nation needs to say clearly, once again, that using drugs is bad. It will destroy your life." In the 80s and the 90s, we saw campaigns stressing prevention. We can do that again. Educating people and telling them the terrible truth about drugs and addiction result in better choices by more people. Now, just how successful those prevention programs have been can be illustrated the fact that in your country every day between 130 and 140 people die of overdoses, which means that every month you have the equivalent of a 9/11 happening. That's how successful that approach is. That approach success can be gauged by what's happening here in New Hampshire, where the number of overdoses are quintupled in the last 5 or 10 years. It's exemplified in this article. Let me just look at it here. Opioid use in New Hampshire is staggering, according to an article published on October the 17th in the Union Leader. So that's how successful that approach has been, which your current Attorney General is now advocating so fervently. Welcome to the Middle Ages. The other perspective on addictions is articulated very well by your former Surgeon General, Vice Admiral Vivek Murthy. I say former because he was forced to resign just a few days ago, and under the new administration, who in November of last year published a paper called the Surgeon General's Report on Addiction, and he meant to do for addiction what a previous Surgeon General's report in the 1960s did for cigarette smoking, which is to say to take a scientific look at addiction. And that report showed, I'm talking about the Surgeon General's report, in the teeth of the opposition of the drug pushers, namely the tobacco companies, that cigarettes actually kill people. Now, the intent of this report on the part of Murthy was not to show that addiction kills people, we already know that, but to provide a science, evidence-based grounding for drug policy and drug treatment. And in that report, he basically goes along with the dominant medical view, which is the view of the American Society of Addiction Medicine, that addiction is not actually a choice, it's not an ethical failure, as he very rightly points out. What it is a brain disease. It's a disease of the brain. And when you say, well, what is the source of that brain disease? Well, again, he accepts the medical mantra that is 50 to 70% caused by genetic predisposition. So you have these two opposing perspectives. One is that it's a choice that people make. A psychologist at Harvard published a book a few years ago called Addiction, a Disorder of Choice. He's never treated a single addict in his whole life. He's theorizing about it based on some papers. So you got that perspective. And then you got the medicalized perspective that it's a disease of the brain caused by genetics. Now the two perspectives are very different. The second one is much more humane. It allows for treatment. It does not blame people. Surely you don't fault individuals for having inherited the wrong genes. It accounts for some of the symptoms that recur with addiction, and certainly it explains relapse in a medical context. And you don't blame people for relapsing into cancer or rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis or depression. Why would you blame people for relapsing into addiction? So compared to the choice model, it's much more humane, it's much more science-based, and it's much more germane for treatment. However, what the two perspectives ignore, what they share in common, is the reality about addiction. Now, let me give you a definition of addiction that's not in the least controversial. It's more or less the same as given by the American Academy of Society of Addiction Medicine. And addiction is manifested in any behavior that a person craves, finds temporary pleasure or reward in, temporary pleasure or relief in. So craving, temporary relief and pleasure, long-term negative consequences, and inability to give it up. That's what an addiction is. Now, notice that that definition says nothing about drugs. So the first thing we have to realize is, when we talk about addiction, we're not just talking about drugs. It can obviously apply to, first of all, cigarettes, which you might say is a drug, but also eating, shopping, gambling, work, sex, internet, compulsive internet watching, compulsive video gaming, any human behavior, right? The issue is not the target behavior. The issue is, does it provide temporary pleasure and relief at the cost of long-term consequences, and do you find it difficult to give it up? So given that definition down, let me ask you a question here in this room, and just raise your hands, please, if the answer is yes. I'm not going to ask you anything about details, just by that definition, how many of you would acknowledge that at some time or another you had some kind of an addictive pattern in your life? Just raise your hands. Okay, great. That's how widespread addictions are. So the first point is, when we talk about the addicts, let's just get realistic about it. Number one. Number two, I'm going to ask you a question now. I'm not going to ask you what you're addicted to, when, or for how long. I'm just going to ask you, what did it do for you? What did you like about it? What did it give you in the short term? So if you would just, those who are willing to say, just raise your hand and then tell me. Anybody? What did it do for you? Yes, at the very back there?
Escape.
Escape from?
Suffering.
From?
Suffering.
Suffering. Escape from emotional pain. Yes? Somebody else? Relief. Relief from stress. So escape from pain, stress relief. Anybody else? Yes?
A fantasy of control.
A fantasy of control, a sense of control, right? Very good, thank you. Yes?
Relief from depression.
Relief from depression, okay, very good. We'll take one more. Yes, please?
Avoidance of emotional discomfort.
Avoids emotional discomfort. Okay, great. So,
Pleasure.
was that pleasure? Oh, very good. So, let's just establish something. The addiction wasn't your problem. The addiction was your attempt to solve a problem. So it is nonsense to call it a primary brain disease. The real question is, why did you, each of you, have so much emotional distress or pain that you had to escape from it? And why is it that you didn't know how to be with the pain? Because life brings pain, right? And part of being a human being is knowing how to be with the pain. Why did you have so much stress that you had to find relief from it, and why were you not able to manage the stress in a more creative and less harmful way? Why did you not have a sense of agency and control in your life? Why on God's green earth did you lack for pleasure? Now these will not be explained by references to choices or genes. These will be explained by looking at your life. Something happened. And it's that something that happened that we have to look at. So what happened? Now the only way to understand human beings, well, let me read you a quote here from somebody who knew what he was talking about a long time ago. This is the Buddha talking about the nature of reality. And he says that everything is interconnected. Big news, right? He says, and he called that the interconnected core arising of phenomena. It's a mouthful. It just means that everything arises in connection to everything else. Contemplate, he says, the nature of interconnected core arising during every moment. In other words, always look at the whole picture, the gestalt, the unity, the connections, to understand anything. When you look at the leaf or a raindrop, meditate on all the conditions, near and distant, that have contributed to the presence of that leaf or raindrop. Well, think of that raindrop, or that leaf. It contains the sun, right? Photosynthesis. It contains the earth, the minerals, contains the sky, the water. It's not an individual entity. The birth and death of any phenomenon are connected to the birth and death of all other phenomena. The one contains the many, and the many contains the one. Without the one, there cannot be the many. Without the many, there cannot be the one. Now, to put that in modern medical terms, we talk about the biopsychosocial nature of human beings. Biopsychosocial means that you cannot separate people's biology from their psychology, their emotions, and from their social relationships. Nothing exists, no phenomena exist in isolation from other phenomena. Now, let me give you an example. It's nothing to do with addictions. A study in the United States last year showed that if you're a black woman, the more experiences of racism you have to endure, the greater your risk of asthma. Many other studies have shown that the more stressed the parents are, the more likely the kid is to have asthma. Well, these studies have been repeated, they're not controversial, but I know from experience that if you ask the average medical school class, or the average physician for that matter, to explain the physiology behind it, let alone what to do with it, they wouldn't know what to say. Because our education just focuses on the biological. We don't look at the psychological, emotional, and the social as they affect the biology. Now, it's very simple physiologically. Anybody here ever been treated for asthma? Anybody here? Yeah? What did they give you? Do you remember? Albuterol and steroids. Thank you very much. So albuterol is an inhaler that opens up the narrowed airways, and steroids suppress the inflammation in the airways. Now, albuterol is a copy of adrenaline. The steroids are a copy of cortisol. What are adrenaline and cortisol? Anybody know? Stress hormones. In other words, we're treating asthma with stress hormones. Should it maybe not occur to us that stress may have something to do with the onset of that condition? By the way, steroids are the commonest used medication all across medicine. We use the stress hormone in virtually every condition that we deal that has to do with inflammation. Which should tell us something about the nature of inflammation and its relationship to stress. And there's a lot of research on that. It's not even controversial. So, for example, people that had suffered childhood stress and abuse have higher risk of inflammation as adults. Why? Because human beings, and therefore they have higher risk of heart disease and cancer and autoimmune disease. Straightforward relationship. Because you can't separate the biology from the psychology and from the social relationships. It's the same in addiction. So what I'm saying is that to understand addiction fully, we have to have a perspective that's not to do with choices, which is utter nonsense. I don't know a single person who ever chose to be an addict, who ever woke up one morning and said, my ambition is to be an addict. If anybody here chose to be an addict, please raise your hand right now and tell me why you did that. And we have to get beyond the disease model. And again, as I said, to do that, we have to look at people's lives in the context of their psychological and social relationships. Because yes, addiction does involve the brain, and we can show in brain scans that there are abnormalities in the certain key circuits in the addicted brain, which is, by the way, not just restricted to drugs. So there's abnormal functioning in any addiction. Therefore, to isolate drug addiction and to say, well, that's the problem. Well, yeah, it is a problem. But it's not the problem. And it's not separable from the general problem of addiction in a society. So, it's not the primary problem, it's the attempt to solve a problem. And what we have to understand is, how did that problem arise? Well, let's just go this layer by layer. Because as I say in my book, if you understand addiction, you just can't take any one single perspective. You have to look at the whole picture, and you have to kind of shake it up like a kaleidoscope to see it from many different perspectives. So, let's look at the next level. First level is the attempt to solve a life problem. Now, as a Hungarian-born, like myself, psychiatrist Thomas Hora said, all addictions are an attempt to control our life experiences by external remedies, he said. The meaning of all addictions could be defined as endeavors at controlling our life experiences with the help of external remedies. Unfortunately, all external means of improving our life experiences are double-edged swords. They're always good and bad. No external remedy improves our condition without at the same time making it worse. So that's the first level. It's an attempt to somehow controlling your life experience, which is what we've established. On the second level, let's look at it from a more narrowly medical perspective. So I was diagnosed with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, in my 50s. I was a successful doctor, a family physician. I was the head of palliative care at Vancouver's largest hospital. I wrote a national medical column. How can this guy have ADD? Well, you could do that if you came to my room and saw the mess in my room, the disorder in my personal life, my poor impulse control, my lateness, my disorganization, my frustration at not having fulfilled my potential. Very typical ADD outcomes. The difficulties in my marriage, the troubles of my children. So, I was diagnosed and prescribed. Well, let me pause here for a minute. So again, ADD is defined as this inherited brain disease. Utter nonsense. It's neither inherited nor is it a disease. I'll tell you what it is. It's not unlike addiction in that sense. The hallmark of ADD is this tuning out, the absent-mindedness, problem, difficulty, as your current president demonstrates very saliently, difficulty holding to a single thought in extreme cases, which he represents, by the way. Inattention. He's never read a book in his whole life. Now, and his biographer is describing as flitting about like a butterfly, one thing to another. That tuning out, that absent-mindedness, what is that about? Why do we have that capacity? Because it's a human capacity that we all have. Why do we have it? What's its function? Anybody? Yeah. Trying to forget something? Close. It's not so much trying to forget it. Go ahead.
Survival.
In what sense? How does it help you survive? Okay, go ahead.
You sort by priorities then. What do I have to attend to and what can I...
Okay, so first of all, you have to have selective attention. You can't be attending right now to every sensation. Your brain is getting millions of bits of data from your viscera every split second. You can't be attending to them all. So there has to be selective attention. That's one function of it. But there's another one, which goes back more to what somebody else said, forgetting difficult things. It's not about forgetting difficult things, it's enduring difficult things. If I were to stress you right, any one of you right now, let's say, Patty, if I were to stress you right now, become abusive towards you, just verbally, what would be your options? What could you do? Well, somebody help her out. What would be the options? Yeah? Go ahead.
You would run away.
You could just run away. You could just get out of the room, right? I'm not going to sit here and listen to this guy assault me verbally like that. I'm getting out of here. That's one option, right? What's another one?
Confront you.
Sorry?
Confront.
You could confront me. You could fight back. So flight or fight. Exactly. There's a third option. If you couldn't engage either one, but given that there were... No, we don't have to go there just yet. You don't have to go to Fiji just yet. There are several dozen people here in the room with you. What else could you do? You could ask for help. Now, you could ask for help. But what if you couldn't escape, fight back, or ask for help because the situation didn't give you those options? Now what would you do?
Internalize.
You wouldn't do anything. Your brain would do something. You disassociate so that you wouldn't be overwhelmed. So it's a coping mechanism for stress, is what it is. Now, how it becomes a medical condition, I'll tell you about in a little while. But it's meant to be a temporary thing, not a long-term thing. So the problem happens when coping mechanisms that are meant to be there temporarily become long-term. In other words, where they go from being a temporary state to a long-term trait. Let me quote you from an article published by the American Academy of Pediatrics in the Journal of Pediatrics, which is their official journal. The article is from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, published in 2012. It's one of these seminal articles that's published in a major journal and makes no impact whatsoever on medical practice. So here's what they say. Growing scientific evidence demonstrates that social and physical environments that threaten human development because of scarcity, stress, or instability can lead to short-term physiologic and psychological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which may come at a significant cost to long-term outcomes in learning, behavior, health, and longevity. In other words, the ways that young children adapt to stress in their environment helps them endure that stress, but those same coping mechanisms become source of pathology, learning problems, and health problems later on. And that's just the question, how does that happen? And what conditions engendered those coping mechanisms? So in any case, I was diagnosed with ADHD, And I was prescribed dexedrine, which is a stimulant, which elevates the level of a chemical in the brain called dopamine. That really helped me. I became a much more efficient workaholic for several years. And it helped me write a couple of my books. Didn't do anything for me in terms of personal development, but it certainly helped me get things done. Now, what else elevates dopamine levels? Well, all the stimulants do. And I'll be telling you about dopamine in a little while. Cocaine does, crystal meth does, nicotine does, caffeine does. So I was talking to somebody at lunchtime today who told me that when they did, I think it was cocaine, instead of getting all hyper like a lot of people do, they calm down. They can get things done. When somebody tells you that, what are they telling you? They're telling you, first of all, they're handing you the diagnosis on a platter. They're saying, I got ADD. And about 30% of stimulant addicts, according to the studies, are actually self-medicating ADHD. And what I'm saying about addictions is, very often they're self-medications. And it doesn't have to be with drugs. Because when I had my addictive behaviors, really, in the midst of those behaviors, I was very focused and present. No ADD then at all. My memory was perfect because those activities also elevate dopamine levels in the brain, just like the cocaine or crystal meth does. So, self-medication. People self-medicate ADHD with pot, with cannabis, because it calms the hyperactive brain, or with alcohol. People self-medicate anxiety with cannabis, with opiates, and with tranquilizers. People self-medicate depression. Cocaine, like Prozac, elevates serotonin levels in the brain temporarily. So people self-medicate depression with addictions. People self-medicate social phobia. People self-medicate post-traumatic stress disorder, saliently with opiates, which is why a lot of the veterans coming back from your crusades around the world self-medicate with opiates. And when that happens, there goes honor our young men and women, honor our heroes. What they do is they get jailed and pretty badly treated. So it's a self-medication for post-traumatic stress disorder, relieving the symptoms temporarily. So on the second level then, addictions are very often about self-medications. And if that's the case, we've got to be dealing with what they're self-medicating, not just with the behavior of addiction. No, let's go deeper. Let's look at the brain on addiction. So we've mentioned the opiates as a self-medication for PTSD and other conditions. Why do the opiates work in the human brain anyway? Like, why does this product from Afghanistan, by the way, I should tell you, just a fact here. I'm not here to talk politics, I'm just telling you facts. Since the Western-led, the US-led war in Afghanistan, the production of opium has gone up exponentially. Congratulations and thank you very much. That's just the reality. Now, why do the opiates even work in the human brain? Anybody know? Yeah?
Do they block reuptake channels or bind to dopamine receptors?
Yeah, well, you're sort of meandering in the right ballpark, but you're not quite there. Yeah.
Because we have endogenous opiates or
We have our own opiate system. We have our own opiate system. And so that means that we have molecules on our cell surfaces where the opiate molecule can bind, because the opiate resembles our internal opiate sufficiently that the cell doesn't know the difference. So we have receptors for them, and in fact the internal opiate systems are called, internal opiates are called endorphins, and endorphin literally means endogenous morphine-like substance. That's what endorphin is. So why do we have an internal endorphin system? Well, we've used opiates in medicine for at least 2,000 years, probably longer. Probably longer. For what? What is their salient use? Pain relief. So when I was working in palliative care, every day I could get on my knees and be grateful for the opiates, because without them a lot of people would die in excruciating pain from cancer and other terminal conditions. But the opiates do not only soothe physical pain, they also soothe emotional pain. As a matter of fact, the same brain center that experiences the suffering of physical pain also experiences the suffering of emotional pain. There's a difference between pain and suffering. I go to the dentist, and unless it's something radical like a root canal, I don't get my teeth frozen. And my dentist is always nervous. He wants to give me an injection, and I hate that feeling of being frozen. I said, Vince, I can handle the pain. So I can have pain, but I'm not suffering. Why am I not suffering? Because I know that it's for a good purpose. I know that I'm in good hands. I know that I can stop at any time. I know it'll be over soon. There's no suffering. There's pain, but there's no suffering. So the suffering of physical pain is experienced in the same brain center as the suffering of emotional pain. As a matter of fact, as many of you have already said when you told me about your addictive patterns, most addictions are actually, all addictions distract. If they don't directly soothe pain like the opiates do, they distract from it. Alcohol, what do you say about somebody who's drunk too much? The old expression. Oh, they're feeling no pain. Cannabis has got analgesic qualities, as you know. Cocaine is a local anesthetic. It soothes nerve endings. Which means to say, and this is my mantra, if you recall nothing else, you might hold on to this one. The first question in addiction is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And if you want to understand people's pain, don't look at their genes. Look at their lives. What happened to them? Something happened. Now, why do we have an endorphin system? Well, they play many functions in the body, from the gut to the mucous membranes to the immune system. But in the brain, as related to addiction, they serve three major functions. Number one, pain relief. And throughout the body, pain relief. We have to have pain relief. We have to have pain to survive. We also have to have pain relief. So the endorphins are responsible for the so-called placebo effect. If you think you're getting help, if you give 100 people a pain pill who are in pain, 25 will find relief because their own system will release endorphins in response to the belief that they're getting help. It's not an imagined effect, it's a genuine physiological effect on account of the endorphins. So they provide pain relief. That's one thing they do. Secondly, they account for the experience of pleasure and reward, elation, joy. Whenever you got those emotional states, you got a lot of endorphin activity in your brain. That's their second function. The third function is actually the most important one and the least appreciated. They make possible a little thing without which human life or any mammalian life or even avian life is impossible, that little thing called love. Opiates help mediate the attachment relationship between two human beings. Now, what is attachment? Attachment is, just like gravity is an attachment force, pulling me to the ground, and the ground towards me, actually. Attachment is a psychological force that draws two people together for the purpose of being taken care of or of taking care of. Now, when I say life is not possible without it, well, think of a human infant. Just how long would they survive without that attachment drive? And it's the endorphins that help them, not by themselves, but they're important in mediating that attachment drive. So the attachment drive is the strongest biological drive that we have, for the reason that without it we don't survive. So there was a very great man who died this week. His name was Dr. Jaak Panksepp. And he was a neuroscientist and he worked with animals. We owe him a lot. And it was he that showed in a laboratory that if you took little mice and you knocked out, if you genetically knocked out their endorphin receptors, these little mice would not cry for their mothers on separation. Now, what would that mean in the wild? If they were separated in the wild from their moms and they didn't cry for them, what would that mean for them? Their death. That's how important the opiates are. So, I would like to ask Mr. Sessions, if a human being has come to the conclusion, for whatever reason, that without this particular substance, they will not experience pain relief, pleasure, reward, or a sense of belonging, how are you going to take that away from them? Put a sign on the highway, just say no. Just say no to pain relief. Say no to pleasure and relief. Say no to human connection. As one sex trade worker told me, the first time she did heroin, she said, it felt like a warm, soft hug. Now, I mentioned dopamine. Dopamine is the incentive motivation chemical. Without that, we're listless, lack vitality. We don't do anything. In fact, we can't live. So dopamine flows when you're exploring a novel object or a novel environment. Dopamine flows when you're seeking food or seeking a sexual partner. In any activity that involves motivation, incentive, you have to have dopamine functioning. And all the addictions activate dopamine functions. The stimulants drugs most directly, but not exclusively. So you tell a human being who without that particular behavior or substance feels no vitality, no incentive, no motivation, no sense of being alive, just say no. So that's the second brain circuit involved in addiction. The third one somebody already mentioned, when you're stressed and you don't know how to regulate your stress, addiction is one way. Now, I mean, we're meant to be stressed because if I was being abusive towards Patty, she'd have to be stressed. Stress means that her emotional apparatus in the brain would trigger the hypothalamus, which is a gland in the brain, and which controls the autonomic nervous system at the same time, to actually begin a cascade of neurological and hormonal influences that would result in the release of the stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, that would help her escape or fight back. So we have to be stressed. Stress is not a bad thing. It's necessary for life. But if we're stressed chronically, now we're in trouble. Because those same stress hormones can ulcerate your intestines, thin your bones, give you osteoporosis, make you depressed, give you heart disease, and suppress your immune system so you're more prone to have cancer. And then we end up using the stress hormone to, when people's stress system has run out, we give them extra stress hormones to keep their bodies from being too inflamed. And in a nutshell, there's a story of a lot of heart disease and autoimmune disease and cancer. Only we don't connect us to people's lives. That's in my book, When the Body Says No. So we have to have stress regulation. And the addict doesn't have it. Those circuits have not developed. There has to be a way of dampening the stress. Otherwise, it'll kill us. Again, helpful in the short term, negative in the long term. So addicts use the addictions to regulate their stresses, to lower their stress levels, which then immediately raises a question. Let's say a bunch of geniuses were together in Washington, or in Ottawa in the case of my country, and they were trying to figure out, what should we do about addiction? Well, all the research shows, which it does, that stress is the biggest driver of addictive relapse. So these geniuses then come together and they say, hey, I got it. Let's stress people. Let's ostracize them and exclude them and criminalize them and suppress them and judge them. Surely that will help. Which is the logic behind the war on drugs. Which there isn't a war on drugs. You can't make war on inanimate objects, it's just a war on human beings. And which human beings, I'll tell you about in a minute. So the stress regulation circuits don't work. And finally, impulse regulation. So impulse regulation is important for human life. I mean, I may have an impulse, a sexual impulse, or a kind of behavioral impulse, or now, you know, one of the hallmarks of ADD, by the way, is poor impulse control, which means that if you're an ADD male, really dysregulated, you might have this impulse to grab women by their crotch. You might even talk about it and boast about it publicly, which in this country gets you elected as president. So lack of impulse control. Now, there's nothing wrong with the sexual impulse, but there's something wrong with acting it out in certain situations. Well, that's okay, because here in my brain, your brain, there's a part of the brain, I'm pointing to it actually, it's called the right orbital frontal cortex, whose job it is to regulate impulses. In other words, the cortex doesn't so much initiate behaviors as to it inhibits them. The impulses arise from the lower brain centers. The cortex says, no, not right now, not here. Now, if you do brain scans on drug addicts, which have been done, the commonest brain finding is abnormality in the part of the brain that regulates impulses. So as somebody astutely said, the problem in addiction is not lack of free will, but lack of a free won't. Nothing to say no with. Now the question is, so these four circuits, the opiate, the dopamine, the stress regulation, the impulse regulation, security, what happened? What happened here? Well, the Admiral, Vice Admiral Murthy's report basically says that the drugs, once you start to use them, interfere with these circuits, which they do. But what happened before? So what the brain theory of addiction totally ignores is the scientific information, how the brain actually develops. And it turns out that the human brain develops in interaction with the environment. So which circuits develop physiologically, biochemically, which systems get coordinated and which do not, depends very much on the environment. So if you take a child with good genes and good eyes and you put him in a dark room for 5 years, he'll be blind thereafter for the rest of his life, because the circuits of vision require light waves to stimulate them. If there's no light waves, the brain says, why should I develop visual circuits? I might as well put that energy into hearing or touch or smell. So it's the environment that triggers the genes to create the proteins that lead to the development of brain circuits. So I'm going to quote you now from the same Harvard article, from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, Journal of Pediatrics, 2012, in which they not so much break new ground as they summarize, they collate the research that has been extant for a couple of decades now and is being added to all the time. The architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follows. Now, they didn't say some of the health. They said all the health, learning, and behavior that follows. And they said the architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth. Now, what does that mean? That means that the emotional experiences of the moment during pregnancy are already having an impact on the brain of the developing child. So after 9/11, there was a study done of women who suffered PTSD from 9/11 while pregnant. 1 year later, their children still had abnormal stress hormones levels, which meant they're going to be more prone for inflammation and more prone for addiction, unless that's reversed. But the point is, what happened during pregnancy had an impact well long after the pregnancy. And you can show this, women who are abused during pregnancy, their kids are much more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD or other problems 7 or 8 years later. Which means, as I point out in my book, on my appendix on prevention, You don't prevent addiction by going into schools and telling kids how bad drugs are. You just don't. And the reason you don't is because the kids who are listening to adults are not at risk. And the kids who are at risk are not listening to adults. The prevention of addiction needs to begin at the first prenatal visit. And how you look after pregnant women and the stresses that they're under, and on birth and all that. So that's the first paragraph. Second paragraph. The interaction of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain because genes are turned on and off by experience. And it's critically influenced by, and now they give the essential quality that's needed for healthy brain development, is critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years. So the essential condition needed for the healthy development of the brain is the presence of emotionally attuned, emotionally available, consistently available, non-stressed, non-depressed parenting caregivers. Because when parents are stressed, or depressed, or distracted, or traumatized, whatever, they can't be that responsive to their children as much as they want to be. Want to know why the rates of ADHD are going up in this country and across the industrialized world? Want to know why so many kids are being diagnosed with all these mental health conditions? Look at that paragraph. Because the parenting environment in this culture has become so stressed. Nothing to do with genes, or very little to do with genes. Mostly to do with the environment and how their brains are developing. Now, want to know about my ADHD? Look at my infancy. I was born in Budapest, Hungary, 1944, 73 years ago, to Jewish parents, to Jewish mom. My father was away in forced labor, and at 2 months of age, when I was 2 months of age, the German army occupied Hungary, which at that time was the only Eastern European nation where the genocide had not yet exterminated the Jewish population, and now it was our turn. And the day after the Wehrmacht marched into Budapest, my mother phoned the pediatrician to say, "Would you please come and see Gabor because he's crying all the time?" And the doctor says, "Sure, I'll come, but I should tell you, all my Jewish babies are crying." Now, of course, what did I, as a 2-month-old, know about Germans and genocide and Hitler and all that? Nothing. What was I reacting to? My mother's stress levels. At the University of Washington in Seattle, they did an EEG study, electroencephalograms of 6-month-old infants whose mothers were depressed, postpartum depression. Comparing them to the EEGs of infants of mothers who were not depressed, you could tell from the child's electroencephalogram whose mother was depressed and whose wasn't. The mother's emotional states program her capacity to respond to the child, program the child's brain circuitry. So, I'm going to read you a paragraph here. The child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the rigidity and pain in the body of the mother or of anyone else he is with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. Now, could I fight back as a 2-month-old? Could I escape? Could I ask for help? And we lived under German rule for the first year of my life. You can imagine my mother's mind states, especially after her parents were killed in Auschwitz, and she didn't know if my father was dead or alive. Now that's an extreme situation, I grant you, but it doesn't have to be that extreme, as I'll tell you in a minute. What does an infant do with that? Well, there's a very limited number of brain defenses available against that much stress. One of them is to tune out. But when am I tuning out? When my brain is developing. When every second, literally every second, millions of connections are being made in the brain. When dopamine circuitry is developing, you take infant monkeys, measure their dopamine levels, separate them from their mothers, measure it again a week later, way down. This is how the addicted brain and how the mentally challenged brain develops. What about my children? 2 of them were diagnosed with ADHD. There it is, it's genetic. Really? When my kids were small, their father was a workaholic doctor. Now, why was I a workaholic doctor? Because what message did I get as an infant? I got the message that the world didn't want me. Why did I get that message? Because my mother was so unhappy. Now, infants and children are narcissistic. No matter how old they are. Because it is a question of development. And when you're narcissistic, you really think it's all about you. So if my mother's unhappy, which she was, it's gotta be because I'm not good enough and I'm not wanted. Especially when I was a year old, she gave me to a stranger in the street to save my life. And I didn't see her for a month, about 3 or 4 weeks, I should say. So you get this core sense that you're not wanted. It's not a question of whether my mother loved me or not. Of course she did. It's a question of what message do I get? Well, how do you compensate for not being wanted? One wonderful way to compensate is to go to medical school. Now they're going to want you all the time. And the more they want you, the happier you get, and the more addicted you get to being wanted. What message do my kids get when I'm not at home? Or if I'm at home, I'm depressed. But when I'm working, I'm all fired up and I'm always answering the beeper. And how is that for my wife? So they grew up in a stressed environment. How do they deal with it? They tune out. Their brains develop in a certain way. This is how we pass on trauma from one generation to the next without meaning to, just automatically. And this is why things run in families, not because of genes. Now, what do we find when we look at addicted populations? Well, in the downtown side of Vancouver, which is, you might say, is ground zero for addiction in North America, because we have more addicted people there in a few square block radius than any other small area of North America. It's also where we have North America's first supervised injection site, where people actually bring their drugs and they inject under supervision. I was the doctor there for a couple of years. What did we find? Well, in 12 years of work there, I did not have a single female patient who had not been sexually abused as a child. Not one. All the men had been traumatized, but 25–30% had been sexually abused or abused in another way. Now, this is the conditions under which the brains developed. This is also what gave them the pain. Not why the addiction, but why the pain. That's why the pain. And what do we find if you look at large population studies? The same thing. The adverse childhood experiences studies, the ACE studies. Now let me just ask, how many of you are familiar with them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Okay, the ACE studies. Look, for God's sakes, look them up. Adverse childhood experiences studies, ACE studies, done in California, 15,000 adults, largely Caucasian, about half of them university educated. The more adversity the child had, exponentially the greater risk of ADHD, of addiction, mental illness, autoimmune disease, everything under the sun. Specifically with addiction, it was exponential. What's an adverse childhood experience? Physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, that's 1 point for each of those. And they rarely just come in singles, they come in bunches. Violence in the family, a parent being addicted, a parent being mentally ill, a parent being jailed, a divorce, neglect. For each of these, the risk of addiction goes up exponentially. For reasons that, on account of what I told you about pain and the brain development, should be obvious. In other words, the source of addiction is trauma. It's that simple. And trauma is not a word, by the way, that's mentioned in medical schools. Literally, it's not. Go down to the medical school in your university here and ask them how many lectures they get on trauma. I'm talking about emotional trauma. I'll guarantee you not a single one in 4 years. Ask them how many lectures they get on brain development. what I've just given you here. I guarantee you, not a single one. Naturally, we don't understand how to treat addictions. Now, I'm going to have to stop because I want to leave sufficient time for questions and arguments and comments. Let me just make the point again that in all addictions, it's the same brain circuits. So it doesn't matter whether it's addiction to a drug or to work or to gambling or whatever it is. Trauma does not have to be the overt big T trauma. It's sufficient that if a mother is depressed when the child is young, it's sufficient that the parents are too stressed themselves to attend to the child. They're not being abusive, they're just being inattentive or emotionally unavailable. Just as if you're growing a plant in your backyard, you could hurt it by cutting it or poisoning it, but how else could you hurt it? Just by depriving it of irrigation or minerals or sunlight. It's the same with human children. Now, does somebody have a copy of Hungry Ghosts here? Yeah, can I just borrow it? Thank you. So, maybe I'll talk about drug policy and treatment during the question period if anybody asks. So let me read you just one paragraph here from the book. Detective Sergeant Paul Gillespie, head of Toronto's Sex Crimes Unit, rescued children from the purveyors of internet pornography. As the Globe and Mail, a Canadian newspaper, reported on his retirement from police work, 6 years at that job had not inured him to the horrors he witnessed. Paul Gillespie, the article says, still can't get used to the sounds of crying and pain in the graphic videos being raped and molested that he has seen all too often on the web. It's beyond horrible to listen to the soundtracks of these movies, said Canada's best-known child porn cop. But it is the silent images of desolate children that tear most at his heart. They're not accepting, they're not screaming, just accepting, he said, of the infants captured in these pictures. They have dead eyes. You can still tell that their spirit is broken. That's their life. Now the dead eyes, what do they mean? It's another brain defense. You just shut down your emotions because it's unbearable. You push them down. What's another word for pushing something down? Depressing. What do you think depression is about? Not an inherited brain disease. It begins as a coping mechanism. But the other point is, naturally, when you shut down the pain, so you won't feel your vulnerability, you also stop developing. Because for development, you need to be vulnerable. Nothing grows when it's not vulnerable. A plant doesn't grow where it's hard and thick, it grows where it's green and soft and vulnerable. A crustacean animal, like a crab, cannot grow inside a hard shell. It has to mold, make itself very vulnerable. You want people to grow? Make it safe for them to be vulnerable. But the second point is, if that same compassionate cop had transferred to the drug squad, who do you think he'd be chasing in the streets? The same kids that he didn't rescue. And there's your drug policy in a nutshell. We fail to protect young children. We stress their parents. We don't deal with trauma. And then their brains develop in a certain way, and then they turn to certain substances that arbitrarily we've declared to be criminal activities. It's quite okay to kill yourself with cigarettes or alcohol. Not okay to do that with heroin. So we've permitted them socially to be abused, and then we punish them for having run away from their pain by using those particular substances. And for that reason, you have millions of people in the jails in your country. So that, you probably know this because President Obama said this in a speech. But I'm very glad to see he's doing so well. There was a report in the New York Times this morning. He's going to speak to a Wall Street firm and get only $400,000 for an hour-long speech, which I think you're getting me very cheap here, actually. But I was worried. I was worried about him, how he's going to make it after the presidency. But it looks like he'll be okay. But as he pointed out in one of his speeches, the Americans make up 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's jail population. So in the world, every fourth person, every fourth or fifth person in jail is a citizen of the land of the free. That's as much sense as our drug policies make. When it comes to treatment, this will be my final point. The good news is that the brain can develop even later. People can heal. That's a capacity inside all of us. But we don't need to be punished. We don't need to be ostracized. We need to be dealt with compassion and understanding. And we need to heal the trauma that underlies the addiction. And then we can worry about, at the same time as we try and regulate the behavior, we need to deal with the underlying trauma. Because if we don't, all that happens is you're going to go from one addiction to another. You might give up your drinking, but you'll eat a lot. You might give up your smoking, but you start drinking. You might give up this, and you end up acting out sexually. Something's going to happen. Because the addiction process is the same. The targets can be different. So I'm going to, and by the way, we use this word recovery for the word healing from addiction. What does it actually mean to recover something? What's the word mean in English? What do you do when you recover something? You get it back. Which means to say that whatever you got back wasn't destroyed in the first place. If it was, you couldn't get it back. And those of you that have recovered, if you have, what did you find again? Yourself, exactly. Which means that there's a true self that was never destroyed, never damaged, couldn't be damaged or destroyed. And you got it back. So to complete my talk here, I'm going to quote from the Catholic monk Thomas Merton, who said, in order to gain possession of ourselves, we have to have some confidence, some hope of victory. And in order to keep that hope alive, we must usually have some taste of victory. We must know what victory is and like it better than defeat. Which means that if we want people to recover, we have to hand them that taste of victory, which means to see them as a human being so they can see themselves as a human being. And now they can start healing. So that everything we're doing, in socially and legally, and in the treatment industry, which just focuses on the behaviors, never even looks at the trauma, never even considers that there's a real essential human being in there. It's just all about the behavior. No wonder we're failing so spectacularly. And on that happy note, thank you very much. Thank you. So, questions, comments? Yes. And then you have to shout because we don't have any mics.
Yeah, please speak.
Sorry.
I worked for about 30 years with drug addicts here, mostly in New Hampshire. And the heroin addicts told me that what they were also really addicted to was the criminal element. It was the chase and the rebelliousness and trying to get away with the getting of the illegal substances. And for many years I have thought that if in the United States we said, you can use whatever you choose to use so long as you're not going to hurt me.
Yeah,
You know, don't drink and drive and that sort of thing.
that's right.
And I'd like to know what you think about what might happen if we first did away with the criminal element. Then of course we wouldn't be putting as many people in
Well,
jail.
see, okay, fair enough. Now, I think they're overstating it. In any addiction, the very idea of participating in the behavior already gets the dopamine juices flowing. So in the depths of my shopping addiction, which I describe in the book, the anticipation itself would already make me feel alive. It wasn't illegal, but it was illicit in the sense that I was lying to my wife about it. So yeah, there's something to that. What we know is in Portugal, where they've decriminalized the personal possession of drugs, drug use has gone down a little bit, and a lot more people are in treatment. Now, it's not, but the problem with addiction is people are ashamed of it, and they're usually lying about it. So it's illicit in a sense, even if it's not illegal. It's not the criminality that they were after, it's the illicitness that they were after.
Well, and it's also, some of the patients that came up from Miami would say, you know, the city of Miami would go out of business if the cops weren't getting paid
Oh,
off,
yeah.
if the judges, so there's big money.
Which is my point, so that when people say the war on drugs is a failure, no it isn't. The war in Iraq was only a failure if you really think that it was about what it was about. Then it was a failure. What was about, what if, but not, it wasn't a failure for everybody. A lot of people made a lot of money off it. The military got a lot of budget out of it. It's the same with the war on drugs. Some people are some people are succeeding beautifully as a result of the war on drugs. Yes.
It's just a comment, but the group that I work for at the hospital, we walked away from a grant, applying for a grant from the state of New Hampshire because, and it was with pregnant and parenting women
Yeah.
who were in addiction or, you know, in medically assisted treatment. And they wanted them in their own house or apartment that they were paying for fully themselves and with a job, with kids or a new baby or something within 6 months.
Yeah.
And we just, you know, we just had to walk back and say, it's an ethical issue. We do not believe that this is, and when you talk about the stress, I'm like, the stress we would have put on those mothers. If
Yeah.
we had taken that money and insisted that we would have had failure all over the place and babies
Yeah.
failing.
Great.
And this was, you know, the state thought that was a good idea, so.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yes?
I wonder if you could speak a little bit about enabling, just the stigma against enablers and how
So-
that fits into the conversation.
So what
about-
is enabling? Because everybody uses that word differently, so how are you using it right now?
I have a friend who is an addict and he comes to drink with me, and for months I didn't know that he was trying to quit, and
now that you do?
And now that I do, I'm in a position of having to make a rule or not make a rule, or decide it's okay for you to be in this vulnerable place with me, even though our other friends don't want you to be in that place. And my other friends consider me as an enabler because I might not be drawing the same lines or making the same rules that they are.
Yeah. That's a tough one. In general, I think, if you're going to make an error on the side of compassion. You didn't make him into a drinker. You're not going to stop him from being a drinker. But it's a question of what's it like for you? What is it like for you, being with him when he's drinking and you know that it's bad for him? What's it like for you?
I prefer to see him as a human being, and that if this is what makes him feel like a human being when he's with me,
Yeah.
then I would rather put him in a place where he can feel safe addressing the pain that he feels, and not fear that I'm going to judge him for it.
Okay.
Than the reverse.
Well, that's what I mean. If you're going to make a mistake, make it on that side.
Yeah.
It's a whole lot better. You didn't cause his alcoholism and you're not going to stop it. He can, and maybe if you get some compassionate friendship. Now that's, however, you got to watch that one, because you might very easily veer into caretaking and kind of, that's enabling. And you'll be doing that at your own expense. So you got to really, as long as you're really clear on that one, where you're coming from, I won't argue with you. But there's a bit of a line there you have to draw. Okay? Yes, over there, go ahead.
Thanks for the talk.
Yeah.
Just a question about policy. So a lot of the causes that you describe are sort of these deep structural factors.
Can you just speak up a bit?
Sorry, a lot of the causes of addiction and trauma that you describe are sort of deeply rooted structural issues.
Yeah.
And whether we're or not, particularly in this country, those are really hard to address.
Yeah.
granting those two steps, I guess if you could speak a bit more about the policy side, that would be.
Can you repeat the question?
So the question is that these are big structural questions, so how do you address them? Is that the issue?
Or the causes are structural, but
Yeah.
addressing structural issues and policies is
Yeah.
incredibly hard in this country. At what level of policy intervention does that sort of leave us?
Okay, so as I'm understanding the question, the problems that I'm describing are structural, they're part of the culture. At what level can we address them? Well, look, in Canada, I'm happy to say that the health minister, the federal health minister, is tweeting out my book all the time. And it's quoting it, which is a great step forward. I don't expect that to happen in your administration right now. I mean, we're rapidly taking giant steps backward right now. You address it at whatever level you're functioning at. So on the local level, for example, it's nuts that you don't have supervised injection sites here. With all the heroin deaths, why aren't there in some of the larger centers places where people can actually bring their drugs, get clean needles, sterile water, a tourniquet, and get resuscitated if they overdose? Why not? So harm reduction. In Vancouver, we have a clinic where people who can't use methadone or Suboxone, it just doesn't work for them, actually get heroin prescribed to them. Now that means they're not going to die in the street of a fentanyl overdose, because they're not buying some adulterated stuff that somebody spiked with fentanyl. So whatever level that you're at, you just deal with what the problem's immediately in front of you. People should have much more access to methadone, low threshold access to Suboxone and methadone. Treatment policy should incorporate anybody who's going to deal with addiction at all needs to be trained in trauma, at least understanding trauma. They're not. So there's multiple level approaches depending on where you're working, and if you're a policymaker, then for God's sakes, get educated. Base your policies on evidence. There's all kinds of evidence about treatment and harm reduction and criminalization and what works and what doesn't. But the last thing that politicians ever look at is the evidence. So just whatever level you're at, just do what you can. That's all I can say. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's the best I can come up with. Anybody else? Yes?
Can you talk more about treatment, the best policies?
Yeah, well, so treatment. So if I was running a treatment facility, first of all, no one size fits all. So there's 12 step screws, great for about 15-20% of addicts. But great, 15-20% is really good. But there's no one size so first of all, nobody should be coerced in a treatment. Nobody should be forced into a 12-step group. That's never how it was designed. You can't force somebody to admit that they're powerless. It's utterly meaningless. You're just making them powerless even more when you do that. Harm reduction should be a part of it, because again, no one size fits all. So some people, right now, like this person says, where you're at right now, there's so much pain in your life, you don't know what to do with it, you're going to use something. That's what you're going to do. Let's at least make it as safe for you as possible. That does not encourage anybody to stay or become addicted. It's utter nonsense according to all the studies. But it's very helpful. Now, if you have a treatment facility, the treatment, first of all, once you've detoxed, so what? You get somebody, even if you can get somebody off heroin, now they're detoxed and you kick them back into society. You haven't taught them a thing. You haven't helped them develop as a human being. You haven't taught them skills. You haven't helped them deal with their trauma, their self-loathing, their shame, their pain. And you throw back out, what's going to happen? They're going to relapse. So treatment facilities need to, once you get somebody off their drug, or even while they're still using, say methadone, start dealing with the other issues, the trauma that drove it in the first place, the lack of social skills. Get them out into nature, get them out on the land, get them cultivating a garden, give them a sense of meaning and purpose, of community and communality. A lot of compassion, a lot of patience, a lot cheaper than what we're doing right now. Yes?
Can you give some talking points? You talk about the one effective method is prenatal and early childhood.
Yeah.
So kind of how do we flip the conversation to how to treat an adult addict to where a nation needs to go with policy that will prevent addiction?
Well, for one thing, you have to get civilized first. You know, as Gandhi was once asked about what he thinks about Western civilization, he said, "I think it'd be a good idea." And same with the U.S. You're barbaric when it comes to child policy. You have 6 weeks maternity leave. Biologically, it's a scandal. Biologically, that kid should be with the mother for at least 9 months, probably for 18 or 24 months. Daily, full time. Or a mothering parent of either gender, or any gender for that matter. So, first of all, support for prenatal women, dealing with their stresses, not just talking about blood tests and ultrasounds, but actually what's happening in your life. Then, birth practices that traumatize infants, the medicalization of birth, the high cesarean section rate, all that stuff. I could go on and on about that. Then, if you're going to have kids in daycare, because the parents have to work, make sure the daycare, remember that this Harvard article says that the brain develops from before birth to adulthood. That means that the daycares and the schools and the kindergartens need to be in the brain development business. And what is the necessary condition for brain development? Responsive adults. Now, as in one of my books, Hold On to Your Kids, we point out, my co-writer and I in that book, children have this need to attach. They just do. They can't function without it. So does a duckling. Duckling hatches from the egg, imprints on the mother duck, if she's there. But what will the duckling imprint on if the mother duck is not there? Anything that moves, including a toy, which developmentally is a disaster because the toy can't bring up that duckling. Now, what are we doing with our kids? Throwing them into these daycares with poorly paid, undertrained staff. They don't see the parents the whole day. Who are they around the whole day? Other kids. Who do they imprint on? Other kids. Now you've got this ridiculous peer culture where kids are more related to each other than they are to adults. And we've given them the technology to keep it that way. So they go on Facebook where they have friends and where people like them. In other words, they're getting their attachment needs pseudo-met. Pseudo-met because nobody on Facebook really knows them. They just know the image that they portray. So we've got to get real about human needs. And it would cost so much less than what we're spending now. So if you're interested in those issues, I do suggest you check out all my books. But I only got 4 of them, so it's not terribly expensive. But particularly, Hold On to Your Kids, and also my book on ADHD, which talks a lot about child development. But pay attention to this Harvard article that was published 5 years ago. There's lots of information out there.
Was the author of that?
Shonkoff, Shonkoff, and a bunch of others. January 2012, maybe February. Yes.
This is a messy question. You can address it any way you want.
Yeah.
The ACE study, as I read it, was stumbled across.
Was what?
It was stumbled upon, this phenomenon. He was treating obese people.
It was stumbled upon.
And what happened was these people would lose weight,
Yeah.
and then they would gain it back again.
That's
and he
right.
couldn't figure it out until he sat down and talked to them, and it turned out all the women had been sexually abused as children,
Yeah.
All the men had trauma.
That's right. Vince
And the
Felitti.
women were medicating
That's right.
by eating a lot, not just because it was comforting, but because they wanted to be invisible
Exactly.
to attackers, to people who might rape them. And then
Exactly.
that began the ACE study. And the reason I read that was because I was doing in journals. I was doing a story about women who are survivors of domestic violence who 5, 10, 20, 25 years later, because of the biology of stress that
Yeah.
we're talking about, were coming down with catastrophic rates of things you'd never think of, right? Asthma, arthritis,
Yeah.
well, those things you'd think about, but
That's
other
right.
things you wouldn't think of, and including vulnerability to cancer. And I just wonder about the fact that addicts are kind of the canary in the mine, right? They're the ones who are the most visible.
Well, they also, if I may just interrupt for a moment, they're also the canary in the mine in another sense. And this is what's genetic here. They're the most sensitive ones. And the more sensitive you are, the more hurt you are when stuff happens. And the more hurt you are, the more you have to escape from the pain. That's the only genetic thing going on here. But anyway, go on.
No, that's it. I just was thinking that what we're viewing really isn't just addiction. We're viewing the whole span of human trauma and human disease. And one way to understand it is biology of stress, and that's really important. Inflammation and fight or flight and the wrong hormones that are right for a single situation, but if they are the way you cope with something over 5, 10 years, it becomes such a problem in your system that it's going to exhibit in all these ways.
That's right.
But I'm just thinking that maybe there's something we need to learn from addicts in dealing with people in all kinds of situations.
It's interesting about the ACE studies. First of all, you're quite right. That's how it started. And Vince Felitti, who's an internal medicine specialist in San Diego, did this amazing thing, what you described. He actually listened to his patients. And that's how he learned. So then they did these studies. Now let me tell you something interesting about the ACE studies. So they were generated in the Kaiser Permanente system in California. So 5 years ago, I was invited to go to San Diego, where Felitti works, to give a talk on addiction. And a month before I come down, the organizer of the talk, they had this phone call with me and said, well, could you suggest some literature that supports your point of view? And I said, yes. The average child substance studies done in the Kaiser system in San Diego. Really? This is the organization that generated the studies. So what Felitti's work has shown is that the statistical relationship between those early childhood experiences and the adult outcomes that you describe, what my work has shown is why it's like that. So whether it comes to physical illness in the book When the Body Says No, or addiction in Hungry Ghosts, or ADHD and Scattered, my advantage being that as a family physician, I was very aware of all the literature, at least I made myself aware, and also I could see families multi-generationally, which specialists never do. So I just had a broader overview. Anyway, I think we're coming to the end of this conclave. I'll be happy to sign books for some of you that want to buy them. Let me also mention my website. Well, I'll be offering online courses later on this year. You can sign up for the mailing list. And lots of my lectures are on YouTube, which cost you no money at all. And just watch them and share them, and if you find it helpful to do so.
So there are books outside for sale, just right out in the lobby here. And we're going to put Dr. Mate right here to sign books. So if people want to kind of line up in the front, we can do that. And help me give him.
Thank you. Thank you.